Hey friends, and welcome to Art Lab. I'm your host, Kendall Hilligus. So recently I have been thinking quite a bit about failure. That's been on my mind because I am making this podcast, and I'm not calling the podcast a failure, but the podcast is a very new thing for me. And I have made a lot of videos over the years. I've made classes. I obviously make illustration work and make it for clients. And I also sometimes just make it for the internet just to put it out there. So I'm familiar overall with the experience of making something and sharing it. But this is a new kind of making something. And there's all kinds of technical and content related reasons that it feels very different. And I think the biggest reason that it feels different is that I am really kind of narrowly focused in terms of what the podcast is about on things that matter to me and on feelings and art and creativity and, how all of those things overlap and impact our experience of the creative process. And I've touched on many of these things in content that I've made before over the years, but I've never had my lens focused on it so tightly. And being so focused on something that matters to me, something that I care about, and, the experience of doing this new thing with it has really just made me a lot more aware than I had been of failure, both of the little kind of micro failures that happen throughout a process, like when you're making something and it just doesn't go the way that you expect it's going to go. And then also with, failure on a larger sense, like the possibility of failure, the possibility that I'm, going to do things wrong and I'm going to say the wrong thing and I'm going to not do it justice and it's going to be dumb. Just all of the layers of that. And that struck me that would be a pretty good episode, that would be some good content since it's something I am thinking about and dealing with in real time. And because of that, I wanted to bring on my friend Grace Miceli, who you may know as Art Baby Girl on Instagram. And Grace is somebody who I know her from my illustrators group, who are a group of friends. We have a monthly Zoom where we talk about kind of what's going on for us and what we're struggling with, what we're dealing with, what's going well in our creative practice. So because of that, because Grace and I, I've been able to spend time with her and we have had some of these conversations before. I just immediately knew that she would be somebody who would be great to talk about with this, and she would have a lot to say on the matter. She has a book called How to Deal, and now she is actually going back to school to become a licensed licensed clinical mental health counselor. So now she's somebody who understands it not just as a creator, but she's, getting this whole other layer where she is now going to be a professional in the area of feelings too. So even more reason why I had to have her on and why I had to have her on for this topic. And we've actually just finished chatting. So I already know it's a great conversation and I'm really excited for you to hear some of Grace's perspectives on this. So we kind of describe overall what the experience of failure is like. Sometimes each of us have struggled with failure, some of the kind of challenges and curveballs that can come along with that. And then we do get into some concrete practices as well. So super excited to share this with you and stick around. So I have been really excited to have you on, Grace, because I feel like whenever we're together, we haven't known each other for a super long time, but whenever we're together, I feel like we do always end up talking about these types of things. We end up getting more into feelings and failure and how we're practicing creativity and where the growing edges are. And, obviously, as you are somebody who you're going into mental health, you are actually you're doing the clinical training for it. And so now you're not just somebody who likes talking about those things like I do. You are actually somebody who is learning about it at a level of science. And so, yeah, I knew right away, as soon as what the topic of the show was going to be, I'm like, okay, well, Grace is going to have to be on at some point. And so I'm so glad that you're here and I'm excited to talk about what we're going to talk about today and failure and working through failure, accepting failure, recognizing failure. So to get started, do you want to give us a little bit of a picture of how that can come up, either how it comes up for you or how you've seen it in friends or other creative people you know?
Yes. Yeah, failure, one of my favorite things to think and talk about. For me, failure is so entwined with shame. I think when I feel failure, there's a pit in my stomach. There's this kind of desire to crawl into a corner and hide away from everyone, and some examples of instances where failure has shown up for me, maybe a client doesn't reply to a pitch, or
Oh, yeah.
yeah, right. Or, you have to ask for an extension for a deadline, or just like totally miss a deadline. Or maybe there's like a project that you've put so much effort and time into that doesn't perform to your expectations, right?
Totally.
Or yeah, or like when you have an idea for an illustration or a painting in your head, and then you create it and it just like does not look anything like
Like what you
you
imagine. Yep.
wanted it to. Exactly. So I think that, yeah, failure can be big, it can be small. But yeah, there's so many ways that it shows up for me. When we talk about failure, yes, rejection is really, that's kind of woven in there. And especially with art, again, right? Whether you're working just to make art, for yourself, or on a commercial level, it can be really hard to not take things personally, right? Like if art
Absolutely.
is your passion, if it's like, if your identity is being an artist, right? Like, how do we separate those things? How do we not take failure and rejection super personally? And like, there's not many guides or resources out there, especially
Totally.
for artists, to kind of like help walk you through that process.
Yeah. And I think, I don't know if you can relate to this, but I feel like there is also an element to it where, especially if the failure involves, if it's not just like you've made a work and it didn't work out the way you wanted, like, but if there's somebody else that's saying, like, if there's another person involved at some level, and either through, rejection or feedback or whatever, there's another voice saying this isn't working, I think that can then make it so hard to even trust your own internal compass, or like your own sense of like whether something is working or not. And you turn in the work or you present the pitch and you think this is good, and then somebody else tells you no, it's not. It's very disorienting to be like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
I thought this was good. I thought I could trust my inputs, and now I'm hearing from somebody else that it's not. So I feel like there's the base layer that so many creative people deal with, of just like feeling like failures or having a hard time with their work, or fearing experiencing failure. And then there's like the added, it's like a big layer cake of failure. And there's the added layer of when a client or a professor or even a peer sometimes gives feedback that is negative, and not in a helpful way, not constructive, just makes you feel like whatever you're doing isn't working.
Totally. Yes. Oh, that's so true. Right. And then that, I know, at least for me, that criticism then just will kind of like morph and join my already existing inner critic. It's like, oh,
Totally. Yes.
let's add some more to that. Which is just, yeah, like then it is just becomes even more of a challenge the next time, right? And it can be
Yeah.
really hard to, yeah, just to kind of let it go, right? And let that criticism, that perceived failure exist without
Mm-hmm.
over identifying with it.
Totally. Yeah. And I feel like it also can, we were talking about this earlier. I feel like it can happen on both ends, because it can happen where like you get the external criticism, it mixes with your own internal criticism and forms this, horrible milkshake of death. And it's just horrible. And then also, like, I think if you're, I think a coping strategy that some of us will have is to just keep going, basically, to just kind of push through it, and which can work at times. I think otherwise it probably wouldn't be something so many people do. But then I think the other end of that can be like actually making it difficult to recognize when something is a failure and it should be, like when it's something that should be quit, like when it's time to actually set something aside. And I think that's like such a tricky balance for a lot of folks to say, and I know for me certainly, to say like, okay, I have experienced this failure. Like I want to just like throw it in like my brain milkshake and make it a part of me and just swim in that. And then at the other end, you know, maybe having a hard time admitting to yourself like that something has come to a point where it needs to end.
Oh, totally. Yeah, it can be really hard to navigate that, you know, and I do think that's something that with experience and time becomes easier, but, you know, especially if you're, at like more of the maybe beginning stages of your art practice or of your career, that can be really hard. And I think learning by experience is for me at least, that is kind of how I am able to now look back and be like, okay, like I didn't know everything. I still don't know everything, right? And just the reminding yourself that like failure can really help you learn and grow, and accepting the fact that like we don't need to be, but like it can really be helpful to kind of be flexible and not so rigid with what we define as success or failure, or, you know, just kind of like almost loosening up the boundaries of those words, or you know, just letting them not be so heavy, right? Not be so like terrifying, which I think that's when kind of normalizing failure comes in, right? Like,
tell me about a time when like, or was there a moment when like that switch flipped internally and you know, or recognizing that like you need to hold it more loosely, or was that something that happened over time?
I think it has happened again, right? And in so many ways over my career, right? I'm like almost a decade into like a full-time illustration career, and you know, like I said, it gets easier and my awareness is like so much more expansive these days. But I think creating my book was a big learning experience for me, right? So I think I had a lot of expectations that I wasn't even aware of, and a lot of assumptions that I wasn't even aware of. And then, you know, the reality, right, of like just the experience of spending a full year putting everything into something, and then, you know, afterwards when my life didn't immediately change in the way I thought it would, right? It for sure changed. Like that was almost the catalyst that pushed me towards taking, you know, like a career shift, taking that seriously, which has been a gift, right? So like that was an example of what I perceived as failure, which that is questionable, right? But yeah, I think that I just like learned so much from it, and it allowed me, there was just like, I just was able to kind of like, I felt lighter after once I just kind of was like, yeah, that was not what I wanted to happen. That is not what I thought would happen, but I'm still here. I'm still making art. I'm like, the world didn't end and crumble. I think that's what it is, right? It's like to just sit with it and to just be like, yeah, that's not what I wanted. This, you know, this could be considered a failure, but I'm still here. I'm still here. I'm still standing. I am resilient. Yeah, that was like a big memorable example, but I think it happens all the time in small ways, you know, kind of what you were saying before about if you're working on a project and you're like, oh, these sketches are incredible, and you send it to the client and they're like, yeah, we want something totally different. And to, again, just like, how can I learn from this? How can I grow from this? All right, well, I love these sketches, so maybe down the line I can transform those into like a personal project or use them for something else, right? Like to know that like nothing has to be done in vain. Like everything, you're gonna learn and grow from every challenging experience, right? And like it's maybe a choice to like embrace that or not. But I do think that learning and that growth does happen whether we want it to or not.
Yeah, over time. Yeah, I hear like in some of your description of that too. I hear this like very kind of open-heartedness almost like I feel like a lot of us can really struggle, like especially if there's any sort of external force that's associated with the failure. Like it's natural to go to like a very defensive place of like
Oh yeah.
kind of digging in and saying, no, I didn't do anything wrong, or yes, I did do X, Y, or Z right. And I think I specifically with respect to client work, that has been something that's like really helped definitely my overall mental health related to it. And then also just like my experience of doing it. Even if I get feedback that feels ridiculous to me from a client, which does happen, but not to any of the clients that I'm currently working with. I love you all. um, but it can happen. Even then, though, I feel like something that I've tried to embrace is a kind of like acceptance of it and looking for what I can take from it. And even if I don't necessarily take the specific actual feedback that they gave me, or if I think the feedback doesn't really necessarily make sense, well, there's still stuff I can learn. I can still learn like how I needed to communicate more clearly, how I needed to like support, like, I'm the one who's the expert in this, so I need to be able to kind of reach back and provide that contextualization for them. Yeah, so I think that having that kind of open-heartedness to recognize like, yes, it's not working, but like there's all these things that I can take away from this. Yeah, and it can feel like a failure initially, and even to be able to just call it what it is and say, yes, this isn't working, can feel so freeing. But
Oh,
then
totally.
that lets it become something else almost. Like if you are like, at least for me, I feel like if it's my arms are like fully pushing it away and I'm like trying to get it away from me and, making sure it doesn't touch me, and I'm, in that very defensive place, it has so much more power.
Mm-hmm. Oh, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
That is, yeah, defensiveness, being defensive, that's something I for sure struggle with, and I think is, yeah, so tied up in this concept of failure. And yeah, like I know for me when I'm in that place and I'm like, I don't want to think about this. I don't want to like admit that I have a single fault or
Mm-hmm.
flaw.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like that's when you kind of like push it out of your consciousness almost. And I know for me, there's so many like physical ramifications of that, right? Like if I try to
Totally.
like not even think about it, that's when like, yeah, I have insomnia, or like my neck and shoulders become so tense I like can't do anything, right? So it's like, I think, yeah, like giving yourself the space to sit with the discomfort of you not being in alignment with like what you thought, right? When there's that space between expectation and reality, and like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, just letting yourself exist in that and be kind of bummed, be kind of disappointed, be like uncomfortable. If you kind of let that in for a bit, often then there, leaves, right? It leaves,
Mm-hmm.
and you don't end up maybe, not, that's not a clinical term, but like spiraling about it,
Totally.
or
Yes. Yes.
or over identifying with it, because you're just like, all right, that's a bummer that like the client wasn't into it, but okay, like, all right, how can I look at this differently, right? How can I approach
Yeah.
this
What can?
differently?
Mm-hmm. Do you ever feel like, I think that place, that moment, like when there is that disconnect for the first time, like when the gap between expectation and reality first appears, I feel like that moment is like the most challenging to get through, because there just aren't that many. I feel like there aren't that many good examples of people like doing that and sharing it in the moment. I mean, even like on social media, I feel like it can be so compounded because people, of course, are mostly sharing their successes. And even if they do, and I do this too, I'm guilty of this too. Like, even if we do share something that's been a challenge or a failure, it's way after the fact. And it's like after we have had the learning, the, understanding kind of what we can take from it, and, gotten to that point where there is some hindsight and some clarity, it still feels terrible, I guess. That's what I want to say.
Mhm.
Like, even though I feel like now I have a lot of experience with having weathered different failures and things not having gone as I wanted to and not having gone as I planned. And I have more trust in myself to be able to get through them, like you're saying, with that experience. It still feels terrible in the moment, and it still feels totally uncertain. And every single time I still feel like there's this very, like, I don't know, like you've just been had the blindfold on and you're spinning and spinning and spinning and spinning and had just had the blindfold taken off, and it's like so disorienting. And for me, that hasn't changed. Like that still happens. Like that's still the moment after every single time. So I guess I'm just wanting to like acknowledge that in case there are
Yeah.
folks who are saying like, well, yeah, but I'm not like in this place right afterwards where I feel like I can, have these thoughts of like what I can learn from it or whatever. And so like, I guess I want to say me neither.
Totally.
It still takes time.
Yes. Oh, such an important point to mention that, like,
Yeah.
yeah, like, I think for me, the shift, again, right? We're talking a decade here. The shift has
Yes.
gone from, instead of like a whole week, you know,
Right.
feeling terrible, it's like, yeah, maybe that whole afternoon I'll kind of just, you know, seek out comfort, or
Hmm.
just, want to distract myself, and, you know, yeah, like I said before, just like be disappointed. But I think that
Totally.
that's really what it is. It's like the bounce back, for me at least, and for friends and peers that I've talked to about this stuff.
Snap back quicker. Yeah, for sure.
Exactly,
For
exactly.
sure. Yeah. I feel like an analogy I don't know if I've ever said this before, but it's something I've thought is like, I feel like, I'm a bouncy ball that just has a shorter range now instead of like bouncing up really high
Hmm.
and then dropping really, like it just doesn't take as long to, to hit the ground and bounce back up, but it still happens. And,
Yes.
um, yeah. All right. I feel like we've already kind of been chatting about like some ways and approaches that some things that we have done and things that have worked for you in terms of like getting yourself back on track or incorporating a failure, working through a failure. But for imagining, folks who are like really kind of actively struggling with this right now, or maybe this is like a big part of what gets in the way of their creative practice. Let's try to like get some more concrete, like actual tools, some things that they can use if they're in a moment where this is really present for them. And I'll give a version of the disclaimer that I usually give, although I feel like I don't have to give as much of one because you actually are somebody who's, working towards being a professional in mental health. But I certainly am not. I'm, just an illustrator, just a creative person who has struggled with a lot of these challenges. And, I'm trying to offer and then, bring on friends who can offer things that are concrete and specific that you can try out and see if they work for you. And we're all different. And all of our struggles are different. And you yourself are different moment to moment. And so even something that might work for you in one circumstance may not work in another. So all of the usual disclaimers, take all this with a grain of salt, but we're going to go through some specific tools that you can use, things that you can try out and experiment with if failure and working through failure is something that has been causing problems for you, getting you stuck in your creative practice. So Grace, I know we've been chatting about this already, and one of the ones that you mentioned was just like the kind of process of normalizing failure. So can you talk a little
Yes.
bit more about that?
Of course, of course. So, yeah, I think, just really normalizing and accepting that failure is a part of life, right? Everyone is going to fail sometimes, the perception based on social media, like you mentioned, is maybe, you see everyone's highlight reels, but like failure is something that we all experience. It is a totally normal part of life. And I think it can be helpful to kind of look back, right? And reflect and be like, when have I experienced failure in the past? And,
Mm.
Remind yourself that, like, yeah, I survived that, and like I
Mm-hmm.
learned from that, and I grew. And think which is resiliency, which is like a term I love, right? Like you are going to fail and you are going to be okay. I think just kind of like holding that like knowledge in your head can be really helpful, right? Being your own just kind of like
your own failure reel, or instead of a highlight
yeah,
reel.
like, but just being like, okay, like, yeah, I've done this before. I've made it
Yeah.
through. I'm going to make it through again. And, you know, I think along with that comes like separating yourself from the failure, not like personalizing it, not over identifying with it, which I think a way to do that is to kind of like, you know, maybe like deconstruct the story a little bit, rewrite the story a little bit. In narrative therapy, which is a theoretical orientation I really align with, you know, there's a focus on the shift from I am the problem to the problem is the problem, right? So I think that like that can help, right? Like if you get feedback from a client, instead of being like, oh, they think I'm a terrible artist, you can be like, okay, they weren't feeling these sketches, right? So it's like just kind of creating that distance from
Totally.
the failure, from the issue that you are facing.
Can you apply to that? Like, how would it be? Like, what would like some things that somebody might walk through, or like thoughts that they ask, questions that they could ask themselves if they're like trying to separate from or rewrite the story around, like, you know, my painting didn't turn out the way I wanted, or my song that I'm writing didn't turn out. Yeah. How to build distance between that and themselves.
I think what like works for me is to try to like, you know, be expansive in those moments and think about possibility, right? So like when there is that space between what you thought something was going to be and what it ended up being, almost like looking for like, all right, this isn't what I thought it would be, but like, what is it? And like, maybe could I kind of see what did happen here, right? Like, I don't know, could I like, is there a possibility that like there could be something else going on here? Like that's when a piece doesn't turn out how I think it will. I think that's sort of like often where I go with that, right? When it's not so much, it's more complicated sometimes when it is just all internal, right? Because yeah, for many reasons, right? I think it can almost be easier, right, to kind of like have like these steps to follow when it is an outside source is giving you that criticism, that feedback. But when it's yourself, that's what I try to do. Just be like, okay, this does not look like how I thought it would, but could there still be something here?
I love that. So it's like almost a kind of curiosity where, you know, yeah, you're like experiencing the moment of disconnect and allowing yourself to feel whatever you're going to feel then. But instead of like saying, okay, well, I'm moving on from that, you know, I'm turning my back on that and I'm going this new direction. There could be a place for saying, okay, this isn't what I thought, but what is it? And like actually seeing the thing that's in front of you and trying to see it through like, yeah, those kind of like more objective eyes. I love that.
I think it depends, right? If I have like a deadline, sometimes I just need to push through in the moment.
Totally.
But yes, it for sure, like, you know, these days I mostly work digitally. So you know, when we're talking about the drawer, it's more like the drafts and Procreate, right?
Yes.
But I do that all the time, right? Like if there's sketches that a client didn't end up using, I'll kind of like scroll back and I'll be like, oh yeah, you know, I think there was something there, and I'll almost kind of like rework it. And I think what comes into play in those situations too is like letting yourself try again, right? Like I understand that with the like immediacy of social media and with the pressure to kind of always be productive, I know sometimes I feel like, all right, this first draft, this like first go has to be the one. Like I have to figure that out. But to just let yourself like sometimes it does look like a new, fresh, blank page, right? Like sometimes that is what you end up doing. But to try to like not maybe be so like dramatic if it isn't what you expected, right? To not like throw it out and never look at it again, but to just be like, you know what? Yeah, I'm gonna sleep on this. Maybe tomorrow I can like look at it with fresh eyes and that kind of like curiosity, and not like name it a terrible disaster failure.
Yeah. I'm gonna have to look this up later because I cannot remember who said it or even like what context it was in. But it was it was definitely about parenting and it was this idea of like approaching parenting as like a potter versus a gardener. And like, you
Mm.
know, a potter is somebody who's like, yes, they're working with the clay, but they really are like, they're kind of molding it. They're making it, they have their vision. They're making it into exactly what they want it to be. And versus a gardener who, yes, there's things that you can do. There's inputs that you can change. But there is like kind of a layer of mystery. Yeah. So just like, you know, rather than coming to it with that rigidity of like, okay, this pot didn't turn out how I wanted, I'm going to throw it on the heap and like make a new pot. I'm going to approach it more like a gardener who is like actually allowing for all of these factors that are kind of out of my control, and that there is this element of mystery. And yeah, I'm just going to see what this is. It's not what I thought it was. And, you know, it's not growing the way that I thought it would, but like, that doesn't mean that there's nothing there. Like there could still be something there. So I feel like I have tried to take that approach overall with creativity of being more like a gardener than like a potter, because I do feel like, you know, no matter how experienced you are and no matter how tight your process is, I think there always are certain things that are just out of your control, even if it's only in your own, even if you're not working with clients, even if it's just you and your creative work, there's still there's still a layer of mystery. There's still stuff that's out of your control. So I think like doing what you're saying of like being able to recognize it for what it is and accept it for what it is and work with what's there, as opposed to just like constantly trying to struggle against it and force it to be something that it maybe doesn't want to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's like beautifully said, because, you know, we're human beings, right? We're not like art machines who just
Mm-hmm.
like spit stuff out the same all the time. Like we have days when, you know, the creative force comes and like inspires us, and there's days when it's
It doesn't.
just really hard.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. The dry spells are, yeah. So something else you mentioned when we were chatting earlier was kind of like looking at, in terms of another tool for the toolbox, was looking at the overall context and like appreciating and allowing for the fact that like and I guess this is kind of connecting to what we are just talking about too, like that there are these other forces.
Yes.
You know, again, if you're a gardener, in that gardening metaphor, there's the wind, there's the rain, there's the weather, there's like the soil conditions, all these things that are kind of like outside of your immediate control. Not that you can't ever have any impact on them, but like, yeah, these things that are outside of your control. And you were talking about them as kind of like oppressive forces, and like, what's a way that somebody could like bring that into their awareness, even if they're, you know, doing this as a part of like kind of setting the stage in the context of like what they're working in, their processes in.
Yeah, yeah. So I think it's helpful to just kind of, you know, again, right, be curious, almost ask yourself, like, what oppressive societal forces are you perhaps like unintentionally aligning with, right? Because you know, we live in society, and
Mm-hmm.
we internalize the messaging that is all around us, right? So
Yeah, we're social
for
animals.
instance, exactly, like for instance, capitalism, right? Of course, there is the reality that you need to pay rent, you need to buy food,
Mm-hmm.
right? We're not going to pretend that we can live separate from that, but to just kind of, you know, consider like, oh, like how it has capitalism kind of maybe pushed me to consider this, to name this a failure, or perfectionism, right? That's a huge one. Your standards, like, are they so rigid? Like, just kind of to consider how these oppressive forces might be just kind of creating this like harshness, or this rigidity internally that makes moving through failure and accepting failure and normalizing failure even more difficult. And I think just like an acknowledgement and awareness can help you to move through it all with a bit more ease, right? And I think that's kind of like at the heart of what we're talking about. It's, you cannot avoid failure, but how can you experience failure and move through it with a little more ease?
Yeah, so almost like rather than looking at it through the microscope where it's like all that you can see, just pulling back and trying to include it as like part of your field of vision. It's like a larger part of all of these things that make up your context, and like allowing for the fact that there are these oppressive forces, there are these things outside of your control that impact that, rather than just like seeing it all through this one tiny lens where it becomes everything.
Exactly, exactly.
Mm,
Because yeah, of course, right? Like personal responsibility is a thing, right? Like there are many choices that we make, but not everything is in your
totally.
control. And like that's
Hmm.
really hard to accept, but I think there's a way to like feel empowered within that framework versus
100%.
disempowered.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's like anything where like there has to be that balance, I think, where you being completely on the other end where you're feeling like everything is in your control, and you're just a all powerful agent who can do like whatever you want. Like that can be very challenging, and can end up causing inaction versus
Hmm.
the opposite end where you feel like nothing is in your control and everything is decided. I think that the happy medium of like admitting all of these constraints, I think we were talking about this earlier too, like where it does give you the ability to just say like, yep, this is a challenge right now, this is kind of an immovable object in my life. Well, how can I, instead of being like totally demotivated by that, how can I like push back against it? And to be able to push back against it, you have to admit that it's there. So I think,
Exactly.
yeah, that is like so key. And I think we were talking about this earlier as well, but as a part of that, like that's something that is so much easier to do with another person or with other people,
Yes.
as opposed to like
Yes.
in isolation on your own. Can you talk about that a
Yes.
little bit?
Oh, definitely. I mean, the like number one, advice I give any artist wherever they're at is to like seek out community, seek out peers,
Mm,
because I think like being able to connect with other people who understand just like where you're at and what you're working through as an artist is so vital, right? Because I can think of so many times when I've pushed myself to be vulnerable, to open up to another artist peer, shared my feelings around failure, and then like by opening up, it kind of encourages that friend, that peer to do the same, and like that normalizes it, right? To be like, okay, like yes, like it's not just me, like this is a common experience. And yeah, to just like bond over failure, bond
mm-hmm.
over disappointment, right? Like I think that for me it's so helpful when I like see my experiences reflected in the experiences of other people, and like whether that's yeah like another illustrator or my girlfriend or just someone like someone in my
Yeah.
life who I feel safe to open up to, um who I'm you can never be sure, but who I'm fairly certain will not like
Mm-hmm.
dismiss my feelings around the
Mm-hmm.
situation. I think that is like so helpful, right? Because you are, you're bonding over a challenging experience. And like I think that's what you need to like not feel totally alone and helpless.
Was that something that you feel like came really naturally to you? Like when you're in the beginning, like did you have a sense this is important, I need to do this? Or was that something that you kind of learned through trial and error?
I think it is something that has just naturally always been a part of
Mm,
my life. Like I've always been someone who kind of easily has like found and connected with like-minded people, right? Like even in high school, like I found the other girls who were like, into music and art, and right,
mm-hmm.
and I think I've just always like I wasn't aware, but part of me always is just like drawn towards people who also were like creatives, because
Mm-hmm.
I was like, we keep talking about curiosity. I just knew, I was
Mm,
like, all right, like I need some help, right? Like I need
totally.
other people to kind of like fill in like what's missing from my personal experience, right? So I think that is something that like I'm lucky has always kind of come naturally, and as someone who makes art but also like appreciates art so much, it's just easy for me to like reach out to
Totally.
artists and be like, I love your work, right? And then sometimes a real friendship happens. Sometimes they never reply, but
Yes.
like, but for the most part, I think that like, yeah, my search for connection has been validated or like returned enough over
Yeah.
my life that it's been something that like I've just really, really seen how helpful that like support and that camaraderie has been for me. And like, I cannot imagine having made it this long in the field without having like such a strong community.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, hearing you say all that, it's like I hope everybody listening just does it like Grace, because I think that that's like as close to a universal piece of advice as you can get, I think, is having, the prioritizing having connections with other creative people, like having real connection with other creative people. And it was, for me, it was not something that came naturally at all. And I think I was a very shy and socially awkward and had a hard time making friends throughout high school and even in college. And I remember, I've talked about this in another episode, but I remember having this sense that like, okay, well, I just need to like get my ducks in a row before I can like connect with other people who will, I'm sure they all already have their ducks in a row. So I just got to like get things in order before I can connect with other people. And I think, because of that, it was only like in the last few years, like really since the pandemic, that I feel like I've gotten better at being like, okay, like I actually, this is not optional. And I may have like kept my head above water all of these years. And not to say I had other friends, but like there were no friends that I was like regularly getting into this stuff with on, and there's something about that, like, that there is real value and necessity to having people who have some sense, even if they're not exactly in your shoes, like they have some sense of what it's like to be working through the kinds of things that you're working through. And I think it sounds like this has been something that you have naturally sensed was important for a long time. And I think something that's really great about that is like having the openness again to mystery. Just like, there's not anything necessarily super concrete or specific. I think I had in my mind too, before prioritizing relationships with other creative folks, that I needed to have like some really specific reason or like a problem to solve or whatever. And I think you don't really know what those relationships, it's like any other friendship. Like you don't really know what it will become. You don't know how you will impact each other and, help one another grow. But yeah, it's like the sunlight, you have to have it. And you don't really know like what the plants you're growing like are going to turn into. You can't say that exactly, but like you do, that's such a necessary ingredient. And yeah, so I think I would just encourage anybody who is, if you're like me and you're like on the fence and, feeling like this is something you can do later, it's not. Like, even if you don't know what it's going to become, or you don't really know, like, the only reason it's reason enough itself just to have the connection is its own end. So yeah, I think that's amazing that was something that you kind of had from the beginning and that you've carried it on. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Grace, thank you so much. I have kept you on way longer than I said I would. So I apologize. I'm still new at this part of it, still new at estimating time. But I'm really grateful that you came on here today, and I just love getting to talk with you. So thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. This was so fun. This is my favorite stuff to nerd out about and talk about. So it
we'll
has
do more.
Yes, it has truly been my pleasure.
Awesome. Where can folks find you online?
Yes, so on Instagram, I am artbabygirl. My website is gracemiceli.com, and I have a book called How to Deal that is available wherever books are sold.
We'll
And
put a link in the podcast box, or the podcast
awesome. And I have a Skillshare class. Yeah.
Awesome. Amazing. Yeah, we'll put all of those links in. Were there any other resources or other books, like things that have been helpful for you, that you would recommend to folks who particularly related to failure or dealing with failure?
Yeah. So the first book that pops into my head is Pima Chodron's book, When Things Fall Apart. I think that is like everyone, I think, could benefit from reading that. Along that same line, Tara Brach's work has been extremely helpful to me. She has one book called Radical Acceptance, one book called Radical Compassion. I think that like those are two people who like have really, really helped me build self-compassion, that I think is like such a good protective force against failure and everything else we've talked about today.
Yeah, amazing. All right, well, we'll put all of those links in the notes as well. Grace, thank you again, and yeah, I can't wait till we do this again. All right, so wrapping up here, I just want to give a really quick summary and then invitation to action for you for this week with your creative practice. So some of the tools, some of the practices that Grace talked about that we chatted through were number one, and sort of at a most basic level, normalizing failure. So recognizing that this is something that happens to everybody, not just creative folks, but that happens for every single human being. And it can be trickier for various reasons if it is related to your creative practice, because failing at something that you have made, it's something that you have poured your heart into, can be a lot more painful and threatening than failing at other types of things. So number one, just normalizing that this is as close to a universal experience as you can get. And in terms of a practice for that, at the level of practice, Grace recommended being able to, sit with that. And if there are these experiences of failure that you have had, kind of making yourself, we talked about how everybody on Instagram has like the highlight reel or whatever, but making yourself your failure reel, and sitting down for a moment and reflecting on like, when are some times that you have failed, or people either that you know and admire, or that you know and you're close with, or what are some notable examples of failure that have happened for you or for others that you can add to that kind of failure reel to help yourself normalize the experience of that. Number two is rewriting the story. And Grace talked about how it can be important when experiencing failure as a process of working through that. You have, your kind of initial moment, your wave of like, wow, this is disappointing. This didn't turn out the way that I expected. And then kind of being able to follow that with either a decision to accept that and, move on from there, or to even be open to rewriting the story, relabeling it, instead of thinking of it as a failure, saying, yes, this did not turn out the way I expected, but having approaching it with fresh eyes and an open heart to be able to say like, this isn't what I thought, but what is it? Like, so bringing your curiosity to bear and having some openness within yourself to let it be something that surprises you, to let it be something that's different from what you expected. And that can be, I think, again, really challenging with creative work, because, we're the ones who are making it, right? Like we know what it's supposed to be. We have our intention for it, but sometimes the work itself can surprise you. And that surprise can come in the form of a failure or something that's not working the way that you expected. So looking for ways, if there's, again, in terms of like the concrete level, like if there's something that you have been experiencing as a failure, even if there's like a very specific piece that you have in a drawer somewhere, or, in your Procreate drafts, bringing that back out, looking at it with fresh eyes and saying, okay, well, this isn't what I thought, but what is it? Let yourself get to know that piece for what it actually is. So that's a second practice that you can try. And then the third, and this one kind of relates to both of the ones that we talked about, was just an acknowledgement of and, reflection on the fact that we are all shaped and impacted by larger forces that sometimes we have no control over. Everything from, social norms and expectations to the governmental systems that we live in that impact our lives in so many ways, but, we didn't necessarily make the decisions to put those into place. So all of these things that are out of your control. And, this could be something that if you are in a moment where you're feeling a little bit lost or disoriented by failure, having a moment where you sit down and you just admit to yourself, like in your journal, write it down or do it in your voice notes, however you want to do it, but having some time of reflection where you can notice and admit like all of these things that are out of your control, not so that you can wallow in them and not do anything ever again, but just so you can be honest with yourself about admitting the water that you're actually swimming in, which will then allow you to have more space to actually, take steps and do things within that, as opposed to just kind of soldiering on, thinking that everything is in your control when the reality is not everything is in your control. So yes, having some kind of time for reflection or awareness of that in the moment of failure, maybe yes, acknowledging and looking for what you could do differently or what else it could become, but also acknowledging the things that were just not in your control. And then the last thing we talked about that, I personally feel like is maybe the most important in terms of a practice to try and to engage in is to connect with other creative folks and to have work on either building, if you don't have one yet, or maintaining, if you do have it, and giving some real attention to your relationships with other creative people. And of course, we all have connections, we all have friendships and relationships in many areas of our life, but the recognizing the kind of special importance and necessity of strong relationships with other people who are also making creative work. So in terms of an invitation for this week, if you have some of those relationships already, how can you nurture them? Can you reach out to one or two of those people? And if that's something that is new for you, if you don't have that network built up yet, what's a step that you could take in that direction, whether it's, just like commenting on somebody else's work online, like Grace was talking about, or, reaching out to somebody, if it's somebody you have done that with a little bit already, maybe taking the step, taking the risk to see if they'd be willing to have a phone call or a Zoom chat sometime. All right, so that is it. Thank you for joining on this episode of Art Lab. I think this is going to be the first interview. We have another interview coming up, but I think this will be the first interview style that you all hear. So let me know what you think of it. If you're watching it on YouTube, you can leave that in the comments. You can also message me on Instagram, and you'll find all of my links and all of Grace's links in the show notes. If you are able to leave a review for the show on Apple Podcasts or share it with a friend, those are two things that you could do that'd be really meaningful and would help support the show. Thank you to the editing team at Wave Podcasting. Thank you to Fabiola Lara and to Andy Miller for support in making this podcast happen. And thank you to Grace for joining. And thank you to all of you for watching and listening. Until next week, friends, I will see you soon. Bye.